Welcome to another episode of Rhyme and Reason. Brought to you by the College of Arts and Humanities, we call it ARHU around here, at the University of Maryland. Rhyme and Reason podcasts are fascinating discussions with some of the most compelling scholars in arts and humanities from the University of Maryland. Be sure to subscribe to Rhyme and Reason wherever you listen to your podcasts so you won't miss a single episode. I'm your host, Stephanie Shonekan. I'm the proud Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities. Our podcast series is focused on conversations about how we live out our strategic commitments as a college: transformative thinking, boundless creativity, expansive empathy, and meaningful futures. On Rhyme and Reason, we'll hear from folks from across the ARHU spectrum who are studying and thinking about these powerful ideas. Jayson Porter, thank you for joining us on Rhyme and Reason.
Thank you for having
This
me.
is exciting for me because you are one of the younger scholars that we've had on the podcast. And so I'm excited to get into it, to understand what your research is about, to understand how you got here, because your research to me is so interesting. We have a lot of scholars in the college who study race and study the history of African Americans, but you have a really interesting angle on it. And it's not just the U.S., but also the diaspora. And for somebody like me who studies Black music across the diaspora, this is really a great area. So I'm excited. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Dean.
Excellent.
I'm going to call you Dean because I like yes chef, no chef kind of thing, heard. So
Okay, so yes, Dean, no Dean?
I might. I think a lot of my passion around environment is, I feel like cooking's one of the ways I really express
I
myself.
see that in your research.
So I might have to,
Food
just
is
for
a
the
big
fun.
part of what you study. At least it's a byproduct of the work that you do.
Absolutely.
So, generally in this podcast, Jayson, I like to find out how our scholars got here. Like how did you go from an undergrad at Millsap to Northwestern, where you got your PhD, and then you got postdocs, and then here you are as a tenure-track assistant professor of history at the University of Maryland. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, I mean, journey to Millsaps was a crazy one, but we can start there.
Let's start.
So I did a lot of food justice work at Millsaps, which is in Jackson, Mississippi.
That's right.
And I love and miss Jackson so much. And
Are you from Mississippi?
I'm not. I was actually born in Baltimore. My
Oh,
family's from the
really?
Eastern Shore, so I know where my
Didn't know that.
my great grandfather was born in 1856, the same year this school was founded, and he's buried 6 plots down from my grandfather, who would have turned 100 this year, but he passed away 3 years ago.
Oh.
So in many ways, what brings me here is my family. I
This
come
is
from
home.
a very proud family from the Eastern Shore of like truck farmers. But then a lot of them moved to Philadelphia, which is where I call home, and were really active in activism, worked directly under Malcolm X for decades. So I actually went through a request to get, my family was surveilled, by the state for over a decade for their work with Nation of Islam in Philadelphia. So I come from a very political background. My family always told me I was going to kind of be the family person to gather us together and do some of the political work. So when I decided actually to start studying Mexico, I had to convince my grandparents that it was like black enough, and that it mattered. And I told them and I had to take them to the state of Guerrero back in 2013 before I really started earnestly. But how I got to studying Mexico was, one, Millsaps. There was an incredible archaeologist down there, did a lot of study on the Mayan population, how it moved due to climate change. So on different occasions, because I really wanted to go to Africa a bunch as an undergrad, but my mom told me I had to leave the country somewhere closer first.
Oh, okay.
So I went on a study abroad to Yucatan in southern Mexico, just weeks before I went to Ethiopia for the first time when I was 20. And it just kind of left a big impact on me because I read this book that connected the history of post-emancipation in the United States, particularly around prison labor systems, to slavery in Yucatan, which around the henequen market, which was a binder twine that was used to bind cotton bales. So when you think of a cotton bale, you also can see the impressions of that bind that squeeze it at like 3 different intervals from top to bottom, right? And so a lot of that binder twine came from essentially the enslavement of Yucatec Mayan who had revolted to leave Mexico in the late 19th century, and they created a whole plantation economy around that. So I had spent some time living in Mississippi going back to Mexico around that. And I also got to see in this time, these were Obama years, that the largest population growing in the U.S. South was Mexican and Guatemalan. And I felt like the Democratic Party was really kind of treating brown folks like they would just join the Democratic Party by nature of being brown. And having spent a little bit of time in Mexico and experienced a little anti-black racism down there, and coming from a black nationalist family that didn't always do the best job aligning with the Puerto Rican and Dominican communities in Philadelphia, I had a little sensitivity. And I had moved to Jackson from Tucson, Arizona, where I lived for 6 years, had a lot of my formative years in predominantly Mexican schools, learning Spanish pretty early at a young age. So I initially started thinking I'd study Mexico for political reasons. I was thinking if there are more black people involved in studying the, interpolation of, Latino populations into the U.S. South by 2035, when the southern population is, is no longer majority white.
Minorities,
it's
right.
majority black and brown. Like we could defeat the red bloc. So my initial goals were political, but I got into food justice work. I was actually running a food warehouse, doing meal packaging events with schools and universities. When I had, I think in 2012, the opportunity to do a meal packaging event at the University of Oklahoma. And there was a professor there who wrote the book on henequen in the U.S. South and connecting Yucatan. So I just sent him an email and I asked him if he'd be interested in, just chatting. I loved his book. I'll be on campus. I'm working for, a week or so, packaging 50,000 meals with your students. Like, would you be interested in chatting with me? And we chatted, and he said I was asking questions that were really intriguing, and he asked me if I would be interested in studying food instead of driving food trucks. And I told him, I don't know if you've seen my transcript. I was on the streets as an undergrad, doing more activism than classwork. And he said, I'd get you a full ride if you want to work with me. And he did. And I ended up going to Oklahoma, decided I really wanted to focus on Guerrero, so I moved to Northwestern, which is where the study of Guerrero started. I'd lived in a predominantly Mexican place and a predominantly black place, but Chicago was distinctly black and Mexican around the same time, around the 1910s. That population booms. And today, Chicago is like a third white, a third black, and a third Mexican.
Really interesting.
So it was a powerful place to kind of transition from Arizona to Mississippi to Chicago.
So, Jayson, first I want to talk a little bit about why learning Spanish was so important in this journey. And you said that you learned it early. As a college that really prides itself on teaching languages, including Spanish and Portuguese and Arabic and Persian. Why is language so important to a scholar like yourself?
I mean, it starts with my mother. She was the one who just thought it would be really important, and it's something I really am excited about. Just having a household that speaks different languages, but the world doesn't function in one language. Even though we do have kind of a monolithic language that in English that does kind of function and forces so many people to move in that category. But, it's interesting being in this hemisphere because in the Americas, by and large, it's kind of, we have, a lot of indigenous languages. But in terms of, the language of colonies and of indigenous people that shape nations and things along those lines, the Americas kind of functions through a handful of languages: English, Spanish, Portuguese, French. You have some big ones like Haitian Creole. You have big ones like Yucatec Maya and Tzotzil. But by and large, you move to the other hemisphere and you're hearing languages everywhere and in different languages in any space, be it in London or Dakar or Istanbul. You're going to hear so many different languages. That's how the world for so long functions. It's functioned here before Spanish and Portuguese and English kind of became these domineering forces. So I don't honestly think in terms of our evolution as people, that's something that, how the brain should function. And I think there's a inability, to think critically and to communicate effectively with care and thoughtfulness in one language. And for me, at least, as someone who talks a lot, I think it's important for scholars to, like, especially working in other countries and other cultures in a secondary language, to have a space where they actually listen first.
Yes.
And they work on critical listening first. And they struggle with listening and have to be more and more and more careful. And that's something I've realized as, I'm no longer a PhD student living in Mexico City, working on my Spanish every day. I wonder sometimes how professors, like, maintain their language skills. I have to actively maintain my language skills and be very intentional about it. I can't go a week without speaking Spanish and expect to, like, go and be in a conference and speak in Spanish as, like, a professor, So I think that's just, there's a humility to it. I think particularly as scholars, that's essential for us to, like, as people who have captive audiences and get to say all the things we want in front of a classroom and have no checks and balances, to actually have a space where you listen first. And, like, you have to, like, really sit with that. And you might not even speak as much. I recognize in Spanish, like, I'm not, I think I'm funnier around black people in general because I just got black people humor. But I'm not that funny in Spanish. Like, I'm so academic. Like, you asked me to, I was doing my bank statements and stuff in Spanish the other day. I was like, oh, I need to switch this back to English because there's some of these words I just don't know, right? And I think, it's an opportunity to kind of, like, reckon with who you are, right? Like, who you are as a thinker, as a speaker, as a communicator. So there's a humility I think is essential, particularly for scholars.
Particularly for scholars who, we all think we know a lot and we want to offer a lot. But this notion of kind of pausing and listening.
Yeah.
A lot of your work, Jayson, is in the archive.
Yeah.
And those sort of listening skills of attention to detail come in really handy, I imagine, in an archive. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about archive work?
Yeah. It's selective in its interpretation. I literally just left. I was in Hornbeck Library with my students today because they have a final project on kind of telling stories about environmental justice in Maryland. I want them to see some of the collections here because these libraries are theirs to use.
That's great.
And, I was just reminding them as they pull out a folder and they're looking through, 10 things and maybe take a picture of one, that, like, historical work is deeply subjective. And this is why we're in a moment where there's such a battle over the interpretation of history. Because you can go through a file and you can pick out what you want and you can tell the story that you want. And you can say it's based in fact, it's based in primary, first-person perspective. But we all erase and silence certain things. So you have to be really thoughtful and sound and transparent. I think historical work without transparency, it's a slippery slope. I have to be transparent about, one, my inabilities, my limitations, what the archive silenced inherently because of who wrote it down, when it was written, who they valued, all of those things. So, like, there's such a care that I think is necessary, and a criticality that I think is necessary, and, again, a humility. Because if you're going into an archive thinking you're going to tell the definitive story of something, brace for impact. Because if you really want to do that, it's going to take you a lifetime. I think, like Oscar Wilde said, socialism takes too many nights. To ask everybody what they want at the end of the day, and the same things with archival work. Inherently, by nature of tenure expectations or the limitations of a journal or our ability to conceptualize all things at once poorly, we're not able to share everything. And I think the power with history is to put our finger on why archives didn't necessarily tell, let's say, Black stories. Not necessarily valuing our feelings, our internal thoughts. As opposed to thinking about how much our time and our labor and our energy, and our value as commodities, not necessarily our value as thinkers. There's a powerful quote about, how many physicians and doctors died in fields never giving opportunity to like actually express themselves and learn certain things, So our archives are a reflection of how we value one another, and we live in a society that is still learning to value people,
There's a video on YouTube of you giving a lecture in maybe a couple years ago, where you show an image that I think came from an archive, and it's an image of maybe 15 women with a basket, and you pause and you say to the audience that that you see an image like this every 250,000 pages,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But the sort of attention and what you're talking about is that you are transparent you were transparent with the audience.
Yeah.
And then you had them kind of pause and look at it because you said that image, you liked it and you didn't like it.
Yeah.
It was a complicated reading of the image.
Absolutely. I think that might have been one by National Geographic in 1904, and there was like this biologist, and there was these women where he isolated as like half Negro, half Indian.
Yes, that's the image.
In the region of Guerrero that I study, and I think it's such an interesting image because to me I can see the curation and I can see the white gaze. You know, I see these women being kind of told like, okay, stand like this, be still. Hold it like such, right? Like there's nothing natural or comfortable. I can almost feel like I can see the discomfort, right? In their in their body language. And it's like that is the difficult nature of like wrestling with what a historical document reflects in terms of perspective.
That's right.
You know, you have to grapple with the unwritten, you know, so often. And the levels of, you know, they say a picture is 1,000 words or something like that.
That's right.
It's way, way more, you know.
And this is a great example of why the arts and humanities are important. Because as a historian, you could go in there and look at the archive and, you know, pull out what you want. But also as someone who is attentive to sort of the big picture, you know, you're looking at that picture too, and you're saying, okay, who's taking this picture? How were they posed? And what does this all mean when we look at this? And so how do you train your students to get that level of nuance in their gaze? You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's a tough one, especially as, you know, it being my second semester on the tenure track. I feel like I haven't given a lecture yet where at the end I'm wondering why I didn't mention something or did I mention too much of another thing. So I'm definitely going through iterations of this. But I have recently started giving like environmental writing workshops to professors that's based on some of my teaching strategies. Well, so for one, I am certified in philosophy for children. So that's something that like started really, really early, thinking really deeply about pedagogy and communication and the nitty-gritty. Because I think young people are really, really ready to talk about the nitty-gritty. We don't oftentimes give it to them. But there's something I oftentimes go to, which is a famous painting, 1929, by René Magritte, called The Treachery of Images. You've probably seen it. It's a painting of a pipe, and it says in French, "Ce n'est pas une pipe." This is not a pipe. And I love this image because, you know, you can ask students to think critically about what it is and what it isn't, right? Because it says it's not a pipe. And I asked them to think about, is this the tree that was fell to like make the frame? Was it the arsenic in the sand that was melted down in some geography far, far away to make the glass? Was it the different pigments in the paint that were mined in various locations, right? Or maybe we can think about the person. Was it the time that it took an artist to develop the skill to paint the pipe, right? Was it, or maybe even think about it like in terms of like our own bodies. Like, is it like our eyes telling our brain that we're seeing something that resembles a word that we have all familiarized to see something like a pipe? So how can we think about society? How can we think about neurology? How can we think about materiality through something like that? So I think I ask them all the time, like, okay, what is this not? You know, even with just like walking over here, like I picked up this leaf, which is like clearly a magnolia leaf. And
well, clearly to you, because you study this stuff.
No,
I see a leaf.
You know, but it's, you know, it has that softness. It always kind of reminds me of like cotton. But it's a reminder that we're in the South. It's a reminder that we're on a farm or plantation. But it's also a reminder, like just picking it up in a University of Maryland today that was covered with snow, right? It's also a reminder we're not that South. We're not cotton South, right?
That's right.
And it's like, and I looked around looking for the trees, but it's like, how can you tell a story from just something like this if you kind of like ask what it is and what it isn't? Like, what does this reflect? This reflects in many ways, like how many various paintings or songs or in the South speak to the magnolia, the sweet magnolia, right? And we have these right here, and that's a reminder that we're below the Mason-Dixon line.
And I'm thinking also of Billie Holiday, who's from Baltimore as well. And who regularly wore that flower in her hair.
Such a beautiful flower.
It is a beautiful flower.
Such a beautiful flower. I love that you brought music into this.
Of course.
But yeah, so another one that I like is George Lipsett's kind of like, these are like heuristics or axioms, like to like get granular. Like another one is, George Lipsett's How Racism Takes Place. I remember that, racism both takes place and time. It's not something that's just out there floating. It's not this like ghost that pushes people and makes certain people feel entitled and other people forced into feel, like it's something that is rooted in a moment and a place and time. Like people talk about how your zip code might impact like, your life expectancy. That's because that zip code is rooted in its exposure to pollutants, its exposure to healthy foods, its exposure to, to quality schools, libraries, grocery, all those things are rooted in a place and a time. Racism isn't just this thing we talk about or write about. It is rooted in our physical space. Like this leaf reminds me that we're in the South, right? So I think like those are things for me that are like these little axioms that you can have. Like I tell students sometimes before you start eating, I don't know if you pray before you eat, I don't know, but think about who might have touched your food. And maybe think about who couldn't have touched your food. And that's a lot of the work in history is thinking about what might have happened, what could have happened, what, could not have happened. There's degrees to possibility that even shape how we ask questions before we get into the archive. But before you eat, if you just think about, okay, where might have these carrots come from? Maybe they came from a different thing from the mango I'm eating from dessert. Or what about the metal fork that I'm eating? I wonder where that came from. You don't have to have answers, but take a moment to think about just the everyday materiality of your consumption. It'll take you across the world and back.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
I think like these are certain little axioms and heuristics that I think you can introduce to students that they can that allow them, their invitations to kind of, practice curiosity.
And this and what you're doing here with the students or thinking about how you approach these students, it makes it real for them. So many times they sit in our classes and we're talking about, for me, I'll be talking about, the spirituals. That seems so far away, so long ago. And I think as instructors, as teachers, as lecturers, as faculty, we need to make it real for the students more and more because, they're bombarded with so much information.
Absolutely.
And what we're doing in the classroom is really asking them to look at the magnolia leaf and consider what journey it has taken and how it affects us.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, the crux of what you do, Jayson, is to ask big questions about environmental things, situations, and how those then impact the society, right, over time. So I want to take you now to the work that you do, and have you explain to us. And I have a couple of quotes that I want to use here, but I want you to explain to us how you connect oilseed, your research on oilseeds. I love palm oil.
Okay,
so
let's go.
I learned from you that it's one of the oil seeds, and it's not just one seed. But how does that connect back to Black people?
Yeah. There's a lot of different ways. So like first, I would say, oilseed isn't a biological term. It's a socioeconomic one.
That's right.
By
I
nature.
learned that.
Yeah, by nature. By nature of being seeds, they have oils. It's just something that seeds have to like, help them survive through different time until they're ready to germinate, right? But oilseed really speaks to like a seed that has an excess amount of oil, and that oftentimes happens, at least in the tropics, where most oilseed plantations happens in dry tropical spaces with prolonged dry seasons, right? And if you look at just like the history of just plantations, where right now we live in an era where there's more land dedicated to plantations than ever before, maybe not run by enslaved labor in the same way, but we have more land dedicated to palm oil plantations and soybean plantations, even tree plantations. I mean, a lot of the things that we see look like forests aren't forests. They're plantations of trees for paper mills and lumber industries. I mean, here in Maryland, quite a few of those. And but if you look at the history of plantations, historically they've been in dry tropical regions. When the Spanish and the French and the British developed sugarcane plantations and tried to make rubber plantations and tobacco plantations and cotton plantations, they didn't go to rainy rainforests. They didn't go to wet, humid tropical places that have too many pathogens to cause disease at monoculture, too much biomass to remove, don't have a water cycle conducive to actual plantation crop. Like, it's in dry tropical places. So historically, if you look at where, and cotton is an oilseed. Cottonseed is an important oilseed in that history. If you look at the history of where plantations are, they're in these dry tropical places. So oilseeds become a place, aridity, and where oilseeds become most oily is a way to kind of better understand the history of where plantations are, how they take place. They're not just everywhere, right? They're in these distinct places where they expanded first. Now we've been able to, genetically modify seeds to grow in the Amazon. We can cut down swaths of the Amazon to have plantations. That was not the case in the 1820s, right? So that's part of it. I think there's also the part that, like, particularly with things like coconut and sesame, wherever there's melanin around the tropics, you're going to see oilseed in our bellies. You're going to see oilseed on our skin. You're going to see oilseed in our hair. Like, it's something where, I have the molecular mass of melanin tattooed on my arm, because it's actually my sister's birthday. It's 318.88, in case you were wondering.
It's beautiful.
But wherever that is, you have oilseed close by. It's just one of those things. And every culture has, some cultures that have existed a little bit closer to, pastoral life, cattle, pigs, have, developed, different types of, like, fats that are used for, to replace oil. So historically, those are always at odds, plant fats versus animal fats.
And what was interesting to me in reading some of your work is that I think it was a coconut that was actually used on slave ships.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Oil palm,
mind
too.
blown.
Because it doesn't go rancid in the same way. It's a way to, Judith Carney writes a lot about this on, like, how in order to feed the transatlantic slave trade, the Portuguese and Spanish established plantations in the west coast of Africa. They were very intentional about, what enslaved, forcibly displaced African people ate, right? And they also were intentional about their spirituality, too. There are records of plantation owners that are like, oh, well, it seems like our enslaved people, like, they get some religious, spiritual, connection to this oil, so let's plant that for them. Because slavery, there was always a kind of a, you have to still convince someone to work. You can't just force them into death, And many people it's still strategic in the sense that you have to, like, still, and to some extent, that's what you see in the transition after slavery, where white folks didn't care anymore, and they're just like, we can just shift to plantation or prison labor, regimes, that just criminalize and feed off of that, as opposed to actually having some minuscule and very manipulative caretaking component. But yeah, there had to be some element of care to force people to use their bodies day in and day out, right? So it's like, how do we sustain that, But there's also, things like sesame where, it wasn't always, the plantation owner or always grown in a monoculture kind of situation. And it was something that was grown directly by our ancestors in our plots, in our provision grounds. Sometimes for good luck. One thing I'm interested in and started talking to, like, biochemists and geographers about is, sesame attracts edible birds. like doves and quails. If you look at bird mixes, you oftentimes find that. And I found several records of hunters in like the 1920s, 1910s looking for wild occurring beni seed, which is what sesame is called in West Africa.
That's right. I know it.
But that's what they call it in South Carolina and Florida. They're looking for beni seed because they're hunting doves and quails. So I beg the question, one, how wild is that? How does that not speak to the intentions and the survival of our ancestors? And then two, did the seed just bring, a spiritual good luck, or did it actually attract more calories to the plot in the form of edible birds? So that's a question that I have now. I want to research a little bit more if there's a relationship between kind of like bird, bird consumption, I guess, that comes from the sesames attracting, birds to the plot. So that's just a way of thinking, like, through the triangulation of multidisciplinarity to think through possibilities, but still in the most rigorous, careful, intentional, and collective ways.
I like that you mentioned the notion of interdisciplinarity because your work is very interdisciplinary. So we're talking economics because your work really delves into capitalism and you've in what you just said, we can track all of that. But there's also environmental studies. There's also science, and your tattoo. That's science. That's biology. How important is it for universities like this to really break down these silos that we live in? Which is why I want you to talk a little bit about CEDAR, the CEDAR space as well, the gallery, because I think that's an interdisciplinary space. So talk a little bit about that.
I have a lot to say on this. I think I talk to graduate students about this a lot because I think I present as interdisciplinary, and I'm honored by it. I'm a historian. I really am. I have a lot of interests and I have a lot of friends, I have a lot of colleagues. So I'm interdisciplinary in the way I communicate.
In the way you move.
And then the people I bring into my circle and the circles I'm invited into. But I think sometimes, I think it's important for people to get a well-balanced set of ways of thinking, right? But I think also, I think of, what Robert Frost said about free verse is you can't play tennis without a net. I think sometimes students don't establish like a net that they're really grounded in, and that's what you bring to the table. When you're there sharing as a historian with a psychologist or a sociologist or a chemist or a geographer, right? And it's like, I think oftentimes, and this is more for graduate students, I think, that are trying to really ground themselves to be professionals in a particular space, that sometimes you got to get grounded in that space so you can see where you pivot. And see if the ball goes too high or the ball hits the net, right?
And if the ball goes out, then you need to go out there and see where
so
it
I
is.
think interdisciplinary for me is collaboration and communication, which I think is key. And it's like, I think that's done really well here. I mean, just since I've been on campus, like the number of different disciplines that have reached out to me to be an affiliate.
We are all so excited about you, Jayson.
It's really it's apparent, and I really feel the hugs. Sometimes they feel like squeezes, just because it's like I don't have the time. I have a Grand Challenges meeting tomorrow. I just found out I was a PI on something I ain't signed up for. There's but it's love. It's love, but I do think that I have a community of I remember. I published with a lot of people. I published with a psychologist or a sociologist. I published with a paleoclimatologist, a biologist, a landscape architect, a geographer. I've even done something with 5 historians in one piece, So, but I think really I think for me, interdisciplinarity is like how you communicate, how you collaborate, how you listen. And I think we need to be humble enough to realize we can't do everything. And I think there are too many people in certain fields that, it's interesting. In history, everyone fancies themselves a historian. You'll meet an anthropologist like, oh, yeah, I'm a historian, anthropologist, or a geographer. Like, I'm a historian, anthropologist. And I think that's cool because we need all hands on deck. Everyone wants to do environmental work. That's really cool, too. We need all hands on deck. But we can't do everything. And I think sometimes we have to move with a little bit of humility. The last thing I'll say is, I tell students this a lot, is like, when you're doing that interdisciplinary dive, like, leave your hunch at the door. And by that I mean, like, the questions that you're asking, and the reason why, as a historian, you want to ask a question that's biochemical, or you want to ask a question that's anthropological, like, it's historical questioning. It's your own perspective and your rootedness, that net that got you to say, oh, I could use this. I could listen here more. But if you just do that interdisciplinary gesture to, like, reinforce what you're already thinking through an argument somewhere else, you're undermining your ability to actually be immersed in that discipline and learn things you hadn't expect. Sure. You're really, in kind of a tautological way, just reinforcing something you're already thinking through a kind of uncritical and, I would say, unacademic venture. And I think a lot of interdisciplinary work, for me, resembles that. It's a hike through a forest that you don't really return to. You go and you hit a destination, you do something that adds to your overall argument, and I think that doesn't make you, you know, so I think, so for me, that's why I think, for me, interdisciplinarity is who's in my circle. If I'm working on something that's biochemical, I'm going to send it to a biochemist, you know. We had Brenda Montgomery here last week to talk about her book, When Trees Testify. And I'm working on something on saponification, and that triglyceride science confuses me. And just talking to her in the car, she's like, it's inherently confusing. There's no real definition of saponification. I needed a plant biologist to tell me that. You know, I'd been looking at the documents for years and didn't understand it because I'm not trained that way. And, like, I think there's again, going back to humility. It goes back to humility.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. Okay, so we could talk for hours, but I'm going to start winding us down a little bit. I do want to pick from one of the papers that you wrote with Brian Williams. Who is a geographer. And in the conclusion, so the name of the paper is Cotton, Whiteness, and Other Poisons, which really, I think, captures the work that you do. I want to also mention that we have talked a lot about your work in Mexico, but you've also done a lot of work on U.S. Southern plantations and so on. So there's a quote here I'm going to read from the conclusion. Environmental racism, that is to say, is not ancillary to capitalism, but a central feature, animating ideas of value, waste, and technological progress. Racism simultaneously values and devalues people, land, and ecologies while generating and channeling toxicity. I think it's very important for us to think about racism in all of these ways. So what you do in this article is that you really kind of expand our thinking, because I think we think very simply about racism, right? It's somebody called me the N-word, so that's racism. What you do is that you sort of expand what racism means. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't take credit for writing that sentence for myself because Brian's a real smart person. And
it's both of you.
Yeah, he's a real smart guy.
I love the humility.
I adore him. I myself am not expanding a definition of racism. You know, we all stand on shoulders. So, like, environmental racism isn't my term. And, you know, I think as a historian, I think, you know, it's just something that you see in the archive decisions on. You know, I was talking to students about this today. It's kind of remarkable when we think about the everydayness of our consumption that you can go to any given grocery store and expect to see chicken. And that's not just here in College Park or here in Maryland. That's this whole United States, and that's most of the world. If you go to a market, you'll be able to find chicken. And it's a reminder that, you know, one, we consume a lot, you know, because that could be chicken, that could be oil, that could be anything, right? And I think I tell students, like, that's not inherently bad. That really speaks to how well, in some regards, we function as a society to like garner materials, you know, but we don't do it all at once. And how it doesn't happen all at once, there's patterns to that, you know, where the grocery stores go, you know, what resources they have.
Fresh food.
You know, so yeah, we could expect to see chicken everywhere, but as these things, you know, as these things expand, you know, as different accesses expand, they never expand evenly. They can't on some level, but the unevenness is consistent in how poor people, working class, black and brown people are oftentimes and usually the last to get access. This is why you see with every new form of transportation, there's, you know, where certain people can sit and when people can use things. You know, technologies in history always come with segregation because not everyone's going to have access to them at the same time.
Right. That's right.
You know, there's the triage to it, right? You know, not everyone, if that's bleeding, you know, and unfortunately we live in a world where the people who are bleeding the most get the stuff last, right? So we live in an inverse form of triage. Right, triage usually is the person bleeding the first gets the attention, the medical attention first. But we have an opposite society where we figured out ways to profit, right, from you know, not just making sure that the people who are bleeding the most don't get it the fast, but making sure that we're selling products to people who can pay for it the most. That's right, who can protect themselves. So, I mean, there's so many ways to thinking about it, but racism helps us understand the first, second, and third, the sequence of events, because it's impressive just to think about how people get access to things, right? There's a power in that. There's a beauty in that. But how it consistently lays out in its unevenness, like that is shaped by, you know, these kinds of racial logics and calculi.
Really reinforces, you know.
But that's sometimes created from the very onset, you know? Like, so in that paper, like, with Brian, like, we're showing how some of the first fertilizers, you know, that are created, you know, they're not created mixing phosphorus and potassium and nitrogen to equal some scientific unit that, you know, we've found to be what we need to, like, replenish the soil for cotton. They were trying to replicate Negro hours, right? So the science that held right, the mixing of these chemicals was literally the replication of enslaved labor, right? So like I do think that we also, and that's a lot of our technologies are labor saving, right? And that goes back to this tension of like how do we get things to everyone? You know, it used to not be this way. I keep talking on and on about this.
Clearly.
I'm so sorry I didn't mention anything about the Cedar Gallery earlier.
No, let's quickly mention it. Cedar, okay. What does it stand for?
It stands for Centering Ecologies, Diasporas, and Ancestral Roots. And in many ways, it is, you know, a reflection of what students are going through on campus. You know, the sustainability minor is the biggest minor on campus. You know, this generation, as much as we like to talk about this generation, they are political and they care and they're concerned about the planet. They're concerned about climate. But that doesn't mean that it's not hard for them to reckon with it. You know, and so a lot of students, I think a third of students between 16 and 25 are dealing with climate anxiety. And I think, you know, University of Maryland is in a great position to support students through this. There are 3 Black-led environmental justice labs here and an Indigenous Futures lab here. And that's just to name a few because there's a long list of resources. But I do think that coming together across disciplines, to answer your question earlier, to think critically about how we support students through the stress and anxiety of it. So it's right next door to here in Taliaferro. And it's just an art space for students to showcase their work and just see positive examples, not in uncritical ways, but I think some of the things that I've realized that a lot of people in the environmental space, what keeps us sane and keeps us hopeful, is that yes, we know the bad. We see it on the news. We study it. It's in the archive. It's clear. But we also know individuals and we know institutions that just thinking about them brings us a smile because, like, man, they're doing good work.
That's right.
Or, man, that's amazing, you know? And I just wanted to share what we have with them, you know? So that's really the space. It'll open up in April, and it's really run by students, you know? So I work with them.
I need to come visit.
I'll show you right after this.
Awesome. So, Jayson, really grateful for your work. I'm so pleased that we have you here at the University of Maryland. You came as a postdoc, and we're like, how can we keep him? And so we're really gratified that you chose us because really you could have gone anywhere. And so, but I'm glad to know that you have family on the Eastern Shore, so we do have that going for us.
Yes.
Other than, making sure that you have the resources that you need and that you're surrounded by colleagues who believe in the values that you do. I'm going to start ending these podcasts with a central question. Okay. Really quick one. Since the last time I recorded one of these, we launched our new strategic plan as a college. And so I'm going to ask you, I didn't warn you first, but I want you to tell me which of these commitments. So we have 4 commitments, and I'd like you to just on the spot tell me which one resonates the most with you as a scholar, as an activist, as a teacher, as a son, as a whatever, right? So our strategic commitments as a college: transformative thinking, boundless creativity, expansive empathy, meaningful futures. Pick one.
I'd say boundless curiosity.
I love that. I love that it's boundless creativity, but you changed it to boundless curiosity.
Oh, sugar.
Because guess what? It merges the transformative thinking with boundless creativity.
I just transformed it on my own.
Jayson.
I just transformed it on my own.
And why is that one? Why do you like that?
I think it could lead to all the other 3.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think the other 3 could lead to maybe one or the other, but I feel like in my head, the boundless curiosity could lead to all of those. Yeah.
I may add it. It's a good one. So, Jayson, thank you so much for joining us on Rhyme and Reason.
Thank you.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed this discussion of some of the important questions that focus on what it means to be human. Please join us again on Rhyme and Reason. In Arhu, we're proud to be a community of scholars and intellectuals whose work is both timely and timeless. We do this in our classes, in our research, and in our community engagement. Be sure to visit arhu.umd.edu to learn more about the College of Arts and Humanities at the University of Maryland and our efforts to see a more equitable and just future for all of us. Thanks for listening.